Let's get into the study. If you have your Bibles, we're in Genesis chapter 19. And once again, this is arguably one of the most disturbing chapters in the entire Bible. So just fair warning, very, very disturbing chapter of the Bible. Genesis 19 verse 1 starts like this. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground, and he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn in to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we will spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called out to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally." So if you read Genesis 19, again, very disturbing chapter, but essentially what's happening here is the angels that visited with Abraham in the previous chapter that told Abraham that they've come to Sodom to judge it. They've gone into Sodom, in a sense, to test the hospitality of the nation, to see how they would receive the stranger as a kind of template for how they're going to judge them in the future. That means that they wanted to stay in the open square to see how the people of the town would meet them. Now, there's some insinuation here that Lot, being that he was a political figure, and we'll talk more about the evidence for that in a second, Lot, being a political figure in Sodom, knew the customs of the town, if you want to put it that way. And so he tries to usher these men into his home so that they're not seen, to protect them. But unfortunately, they were seen, and the men of Sodom surround the house and demand to essentially engage in a violent abusive rape towards these men. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about why the men were doing this and what their perspective was. But what this chapter is really going to give us an opportunity to do is to really see what evil is. So we've already, in the book of Genesis, we've encountered Satan, we've encountered some satanic communities, but this is the first time we're actually seeing it, like an expression of it in a really, really unfettered form that unfortunately doesn't change. What we're seeing in Sodom is unfortunately something that we've seen through history, and unfortunately, as I said, some of us have been exposed to this kind of evil before. But this chapter is going to help us understand what evil is, where does it come from, and the overwhelming power of the cross to redeem the world. What happens throughout the rest of the chapter is equally disturbing. So the men surround the house of Lot. We're not going to read it. I encourage you to read it on your own time. The men surround the house of Lot. They demand to have these men sent out to them. Lot refuses. He goes outside to meet the men, and he instead offers them his two virgin daughters, right? Which is very disturbing, and again, we'll talk more about that. He offers these men his two virgin daughters as opposed to these men. The men refuse, and then they start to try to break down the door. And as they're breaking down the door, the angels strike the men blind, and they essentially wander out from there. Lot is then given a commission by the angels to warn his family about the coming judgment. So Lot is supposed to tell them, hey, God is about to judge the city. We need to get out. Unfortunately, Lot has lived such a double life up until this point that everyone thinks he's joking. They don't take him seriously. So even though he's trying to convince them that judgment is coming, they don't buy it. And the angels essentially have to grab Lot, his wife, and his two daughters and drag them out of the town. He fails to save his two future son-in-laws, and he fails to save anybody else from the town. Which in and of itself, just, all this darkness, here's a little bit of life for you. Remember that Abraham negotiated in the previous chapter for 10 people. Abraham said, as you find 10 people, please spare the city. And God said yes. And Abraham thinks, and sometimes in your prayer life you could think this as well, that Abraham's talking God into doing something merciful. But here we see God's mercy is even higher than our mercy. All right, so God did not find 10 people, but he still spared the few that he found. And that's just incredible. So God's justice is higher than our justice, but God's mercy is also higher than our mercy. So God brings Lot, his wife, and his two daughters out of the town. They destroy it with fire and brimstone, but the wife looks back. And there's intimation there that she's not looking back in like curiosity, but she's looking back longingly. Like, oh man, like I wanted to be in that town and God has destroyed it, almost like in a resentful sense. And God turns her to salt as a picture of total destruction. You may hear in some cities, If they burn a city to the ground, they salt the fields as a picture of total destruction. So she represents the total destruction of the wickedness of Sodom. Lot is so perturbed by this that he doesn't want to go back to Abraham. And instead, he negotiates for another town called Zoar, a little town that's near Sodom. And the angel spares Zoar for Lot's sake. But Lot doesn't even go there. He ends up going into a cave, living with his daughters. But his daughters had been so polluted by the evil of Sodom that they don't see anything wrong with incest. And so they get their father drunk, have sexual intimacy with him, and procreate with their own father. These two children that they have, Ammon and Moab, become the leaders of two pagan tribes that become consistent enemies of the nation of Israel. And that's how the chapter ends. So from beginning to end, this chapter is one of the most disturbing and wicked chapters in the entire Bible. But like I said, it gives us a very good idea of what evil is, why it must be combated as ferociously as we have to, how we do that, and again, where it comes from. So what is evil? Sin and evil are spoken differently within the scriptures. So sin, biblically, is the idea of missing the mark. There's a perfection of God, there's a perfect standard of God's character that we sometimes fall short of. And usually when we fall short of the standard, it's because we've misaligned our priorities. So in other words, sin is usually bad, but it usually is a missing of something that we accept. So here's an example. Imagine you get pulled over for speeding, and you tell a little white lie. You're like, well, officer, I swear to you, I just started speeding when you started radaring me. I promise you, I'm always super, and I wasn't even looking at my speedometer. I didn't even, and you're telling little fibs. Maybe you're giving some compliments. Hey, you look really good today, officer. Maybe you can let me go, and oh man, I got to feed my kids, and you're, putting on the waterworks and things like that. Are you evil for doing that? No, but you are sinful, right? You are negating truth. But really what you've done is you've misaligned priorities. Your desire, your priority to not have to pay the fine is superseding your desire to be honest and have integrity, which is not a good thing, but that's what's occurred. But it's not that you've denied the morality of God. You haven't denied the fact that it's good to tell the truth. You're just failing to live up to it in the moment. The vast majority of sin that you and I commit on a regular basis falls into that category. It's not a denial of God's law. It's not I'm going my own way and I don't care what you think, God, and I'm going to go directly against you. It's a failure to meet God's standard. And that's why the word sin in the Bible, it's actually an archery term. So those of you guys who do shooting, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you are aiming at the target, but you're missing. You're not taking into account wind, or you're jerking the trigger or something like that. You're missing the mark, but you're intending to hit it. That's the idea of sin. You're going against something that you actually want to fulfill. There's another word in the Bible that means willful lawbreaking, and it's the word trespass. So when you see the word sin, that's what it's referring to. When you see the word trespass, that's willful lawbreaking. I know God has said this, but I'm doing it anyway. Now, when that willful lawbreaking goes too far, it starts to look like what we would call evil. Evil is a negation of good. It's a movement away from good. It's a denial of good. It's a resistance and a rebellion towards good. It's an embodiment of the satanic spirit, the spirit that doesn't want to bow to God, but wants to bow to a God of our own universe. Here's a good depiction of it in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 2, verse 12 through 14 says this: to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked. So these are not just people who are doing wrong things. These are people who are delighting in it. They're finding pleasure in their evil, in their wickedness, right? And that is what we would think of as the highest form of evil. Not just that someone could become like these men of Sodom, who would actually want to violate someone innocent in this way, but that would actually enjoy doing it, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about evil. I think John Milton, in his depiction of Satan in Paradise Lost, put it pretty well. So there's a moment in Paradise Lost where Satan is in the Garden of Eden about ready to tempt Adam and Eve, and he knows what it's going to do to them. And he's marveling at the beauty of creation. He's marveling at God's beauty and what he designed in Eden. And he has this internal monologue where he's torn a little bit. where he says, like, man, I feel like I could be happy here, right? Where he recognizes, like, I feel like I could be happy with God. I feel like I could be happy in his law. But his hatred for God is so strong that he eventually says this, farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear. Farewell remorse. All good to me is loss. Evil, be thou my good. So that's an idea of I'm rejecting God so much that evil has become good to me, right? That I'm delighting in it. I'm actually rejoicing in wickedness. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about evil. It's a subversion of good. And it's a perversion of God's intent. If you notice that in normal sexuality, and we've talked about this, the purpose of normal sexuality is a picture of God's intimacy with the church, right? That there is a willingness and a submission and a give and a take and a hierarchy and an order, and it's a oneness that's created within the bonds of commitment. Rape is a complete perversion of that. Rape is a stealing from someone what their will would be. It is a perversity of it. It's a subjugation of another for the pleasure of the individual. It's not self-sacrifice, which is what normal sexuality is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a laying down of your body for your partner. This is a taking up of another's body against their will. It's a complete satanic perversion of what God has intended, and that's why these men see it that way. Now, for most of church history, people have actually downplayed the sin of Sodom. And they've said that the sin of Sodom was actually homosexuality. I don't have time to get into this. Homosexuality, I do believe, is a sin. It goes against God's intent for sexuality. However, that's not the sin of these men. If their sin was actually just homosexuality, and by the way, that's why sodomy is a byword for homosexuality. If that was their sin, then that means that their sin is actually just sexual pleasure, which is what we were talking about. But it's not what we see. These men are not after a sexual experience. If they were after a sexual experience, they would have taken Lot. But they don't take Lot. And if they were, again, just after a sexual experience, they would have taken Lot up on his offer. They would have taken the daughters. But they don't. Right? This is not exactly men who are just looking for a quote-unquote good time. In fact, listen to their words. Once Lot withstands them, this is Genesis 19, verse 9. He says this one came in here to stay, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. How are they viewing their behavior? They're not viewing it as sex. They're viewing it as oppression. They've weaponized it. They're looking at what they're doing as, we are going to use this as a weapon against you. We're going to hurt you with this. And that's going to be the source of our pleasure. That is the darkness that we're talking about. That's the perversity that we're talking about. And unfortunately, like I said, this perversity is something that didn't die with Sodom. When God wipes out Sodom, it didn't die with them. In fact, we see the exact same story, almost to a T, played out in Israel in the book of Judges. And you could read it. It's in the latter chapter of the book of Judges if you want to read it on your own time. But this idea of men becoming so perverse, so wicked, so given over to their sin, that they're willing to weaponize sexuality in order to violate and harm somebody, is something that has not gone away with the Sodomites. And we saw this on display even last October when Hamas invaded Israel, and they weaponized this evil, evil, perverse act in order to damage and violate the innocence that they came across. This is something that comes within the heart of men. Now, why the angels, though? Why are they targeting the angels? Well, when someone has denied the good of God to a certain extent, they become predatory. They start imbibing what we're calling the satanic spirit, and they become like the devil in his predatory demeanor. So this is 1 Peter 5, verse 8. It says this, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Right? Predators in the wild are opportunistic, if you want to word it that way. They're not really after a fair fight. You know, you don't see too many lions like trying to fight bears or something like that to kill them. They're just not really into that. They're looking for gazelles, right? They're looking for innocent, helpless, opportunistic targets. That's what they're looking for. These men, the angels that came into Sodom, Because they are the stranger, which we talked about a little bit last week, they represent the powerless within the community. These men, the reason why they want to violate the angels specifically is because the angels represent the powerless. They represent the stranger. I counsel people sometimes who go through cycles of abuse, meaning that they go from one abusive relationship to the next, and they can feel like a dark spirit is following them, like they've been marked by some type of satanic spirit, and that's why this is happening to them in cycles. And I say this with as much care as I possibly can. That's actually not what's happening. What's happening is there are predatory individuals who are looking for innocence that they might devour. The reason why you keep being targeted is because evil, wicked people see you as innocent. And they want to take your innocence. They want to subvert it. They want to steal it from you and pervert it, because that's where they're finding their pleasure and their joy. They also see you as powerless. So there's something that could be done practically for you to be taught how to be more assertive, but we're not going to get into that in our study today. But that's what's going on. They recognize a powerless individual and they want to pounce like a predator. The next reason why they go after them is because they're messengers of truth. They're angels. The word angel in Hebrew, it's malik, and it literally means messenger. Right? That's what the angels do. They give messages from God. These men are so deep in their perversity that they don't want to hear truth. But they want to do something with the truth. They don't want to just deny the truth. They want to pervert the truth. And we'll talk more about that in a second, in the spirit of Satan. Right? So Satan doesn't just take the words of God and ignore them. Satan perverts the words of God. Satan twists the words of God. He makes them into something different, something adverse to what they're intended to be. So these men are taking these messengers of truth and they're trying to actually violate them in a perverse and abusive way. And then finally, I've already mentioned this a little bit, they represent the spirit of innocence. Again, it's unbelievably tragic, right? When you look at evil empires that have existed in the world and you see what they do to children. And there's a reason. Because Satan hates innocence. He just does. And he targets it, and he does everything he can to destroy it. And so there's a reason. There's a reason why kids are targets of predators. There's a reason why kids are targeted by evil, wicked people. There's a reason why school shootings are a thing. Why people are like, I'm going to go into a school and I'm going to assault that which is most innocent. It's because when you give your heart over to the spirit of Satan, you give your heart over to the one who despises innocence. And this is very true. I reread the Gospels not too long ago. And the Bible is not a very, what you would call it, the Bible is not a very descriptive book when it comes to violence or evil. Even this, it's like, it's describing it, but it uses language where you can go over it and almost miss the gravity of what's going on. When you read the crucifixion accounts, there's something different about those accounts than in the rest of Scripture. And the difference in them is how graphic they are. I've read the crucifixion accounts quite a few times now in my faith, and the last time I was reading it, it just really struck me how graphic it is. It's more graphic than any other depiction within the Scriptures of someone being hurt or tortured, and that's why the Passion of the Christ is actually an accurate depiction of the cross. And when you look at the cross, when you look at the crucifixion, it's not just that the men are doing this to Jesus, it's that they're delighting in it. They're mocking him. There's something pleasurable, and it sounds sick to say it that way, but that's true. There's something pleasurable in the heart of darkness that wants so desperately to hurt innocence. You also see this in the first martyr of the church, Stephen. It says in Acts 6, when he first starts testifying, that he had the face of an angel. And then after he finishes his testimony, he says that they gnash at him with their teeth, and they go after him, and they stone him to death on the spot. So again, when men give themselves over to darkness, men and women give themselves over to darkness, to the spirit of Satan, the number one thing that they hate is innocence. And they'll do anything they can to pervert, to pollute, and to destroy innocence. And that's why we as the church, we are called to protect innocence. We are called to be a voice to the powerless. We are called to protect those who cannot protect themselves more than anything else. That's why, some of the stuff that Tara is talking about, and just we'll talk more about it as we get closer. There's a reason why. There's an agenda in our country right now to attack innocence, to pervert children, to kill them in the womb, and to mutilate them. There's a reason why it's going that direction. And it's because we as a culture are giving ourselves over to the same spirit that was animating Sodom. And again, we'll talk more about that. Now, what's the source of evil? How does someone get there? Now, we have a morbid curiosity with evil. That's why true crime stories are so popular, right? And the reason why we have a morbid curiosity towards it is because we like to watch shows and movies that tell us that evil is something out there, something foreign to ourselves that we can't fully understand. And even in more pagan cultures, usually evil is depicted as like some sort of a collaboration between man and demon. It's like stories of the werewolf or the vampire or the zombie. These are men who have collaborated with some sort of satanic force and become less than a man, right? And now they're acting out in violent and terrible ways, but it's really a force that's taken over them, that's causing them to do it. In the modern world, we more have a perspective of psychology, where people are born with mental disorders or mental illnesses that make them evil. And that's why they're acting out of these evil things. It's a psychological thing. It's madness or craziness. But all these things mean that evil is apart from you. It's something different than you. And it also means that evil is something that you don't have control over. It's something that takes over you as opposed to something you collaborate with in an active sense. It's interesting, but it's also against what the scripture teaches us. So when we look at the first murderer, the first one to commit a real atrocious act of evil, Cain, what does God say to Cain? Genesis 4, verse 4. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Where is evil located in the story of Cain? It's not out there. It's in his heart. And God's saying that this evil that's in you, you can rule over it. You have a choice. You can do something about it, or you cannot. You can collaborate with it. You could participate with it. How does this happen? How does this participation happen? Well, there's one person in the last century who understood this better than anyone else, a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. I quote him a lot because his understanding of evil is, like I said, it's unparalleled. Right? And what Solzhenitsyn represents is a man who grew up in a nation and he got to see it become an evil power. He got to see it slowly become corrupted over time. And he stayed 10 years in the gulags, which was the Russian version of the concentration camps, which, by the way, killed more people than the concentration camps. The gulags killed 20 million people. And while he was in there, he got a real taste for evil. He got to see it displayed. And this is one of the insights he got while he was there. He says this: if only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, and at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change. And to that name, we ascribe a whole lot of good and evil. So all of us have performed acts of evil, and we've all performed acts of good. That's something that exists within the human conscience. It's not something out there. It's something in here. But then the obvious question is well, how come this kind of evil seems so rare? The obvious point that I can make is it that rare, though? Remember, they went into the town of Sodom with the idea that if there's 10 righteous people, the town would be spared. They couldn't find 10. How does that happen? How do you have a whole city in which not 10 people can be found who are righteous? How does that occur? So if we think that evil is something rare, it only happens to guys like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy or these rare sociopaths out on the fringes of society, how can an entire city become evil? Solzhenitsyn details how these guards that were torturing people were being praised by their wives. Their wives would walk around in town and be like, man, my husband has so much ingenuity. You should have seen what he did to this one prisoner the other day to get him to confess. They bragged about it in open spaces. How does a whole nation become evil like that? How does that occur? Well, it happens through one mechanism, and that's what we call lying. This is again from Solzhenitsyn. It says, it's to do evil, a human being must first believe that what he is doing is actually good, or else that it's well considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, that is in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Ideology, that is what gives evil doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. What's he saying? Well, let me give an experiment to illustrate this point. Years ago at Duke, they performed an experiment where they tried to figure out how people lie and why they lie. So what they did, it's kind of a funny experiment, is they set up these little testing centers all around the world, right? And they had people come in and they say, hey, take a test and we'll give you a sum of money for every right answer you get, maybe like $1 or something like that. So people would come in, they would take the tests. After the test was over, they would say, hey, these are the answers on the board. Memorize how many you got right. Go in the back and shred your test. Then come up to the front and tell us what you got verbally. Now, what they did is they rigged the shredder, so the shredder only took out the sides, but the center was left intact. So people lied, and they got to check people on their lie. What they found out is that basically everybody lied by like 1 or 2. Right? Everybody fibbed of like, yeah, I got an 8, but I really knew that one, so I should really get a 9. You know, and they would lie, and everyone would lie about 1 or 2. Every now and then they'd get someone who would lie by like 10 or something like that, but it was more rare. The majority of people, it was like 1 or 2. So they started messing with the experiment to see if they could get lying to go up. So they increased the reward. They said, okay, instead of $1, we'll give you $20 for every right answer we got. What do you guys think? Do you think lying went up or down? Went down. It almost went to the point where everyone was being totally honest. So then they messed with it one more time, and they said, okay, same deal, $20, but this time 10 goes to you and 10 goes to a charity of your choice. Lying skyrocketed. And what he figured out, Dan Ariely, the guy who performed the experiment, he says, it seems that there's a connection between how much evil we do and how much we can justify it. So anyone can justify stealing $1 or $2. You're like, well, I basically got that answer right. It's no big deal. To steal $20 or $40 feels kind of wrong for most of us. Ugh, maybe not in inflation nowadays, but normally 20, it sounds a little bad. You're like, I don't want to steal $40. That's a lot of money. You'd feel kind of scummy. 1 or 2, you don't really feel bad about. You don't really feel like you've done something wrong. But if you could say, oh, I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for the kids. Yeah, I'm getting a couple bucks, but really I'm doing it for this charity that I put down. So I'll lie for the kids. That makes people feel good. And people feel good, they could justify all sorts of evil. The mechanism that brings a good person to becoming an evil person is deception. And it begins in the heart. The more you could start justifying your behavior of like, yeah, I'm doing this, but is it really that bad? And you start giving little justifications for your behavior and why you're doing what you're doing. You start hiding it. You start maybe compensating. You do bad things, but you do a lot of good things too. So you feel a little bit better about yourself. That's what happens at an individual level. Self-justification through self-deception. However, for the most part, most individuals can only go so far, right? There are people in our society that are sociopaths that don't really care about what society thinks. And for them, their need for justification is actually fairly small. But when you put people in particular cultures or subcultures, what those cultures support becomes their moral framework. So if you get a city like Sodom, and notice what it says in verse 4, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. This isn't a gang of ruffians. This is the upstanding citizens of Sodom doing this. These are the people that were respected in the society. These are the council members. These are the judges, the lawyers, the doctors. These are the people in the society that everyone would look up to that are doing this. Once again, in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany and all these other places that gave themselves over to evil, it's not the random psychopath doing these things. By the way, if you read the Gulag Archipelago, he details tortures that were performed by these guards that would make the men of Sodom blush. And these are not random psychopaths. These are upstanding citizens within the community. How does that happen? It only happens when a society starts giving in to deception. When they start believing lies and they start accepting ideologies that teach them that their actions aren't actually wrong, that their actions are actually good or right or beneficial for the community if you look at it from a particular lens. Right? If you get a culture that believes such a way, you can justify all sorts of things. And once you justify it, the chains on the human heart that normally subvert our evil tendencies are unleashed. And you might not look like what that looks like. This is why the church has always seen our main purpose in the world is to fight ideas. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 3 says this, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing," get this, "every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." What allows for evil to persist within a community? Lies, deception, false ideology. And for that reason, the church must fight the lies. We have to go against it. We cannot support it. We cannot be in community with deception, because if we allow that to happen, we're allowing perversion to occur through us. We become open participants with it. And again, if you ever want to read a book that will really check you on your deception, like you're lying, that you think of as not that big of a deal, and so do I, read the Gulag Archipelago. That is the most convicting book about lying you will ever read. When you get to the end of it, you'll be like, I can't lie at all, right? It's that hardcore, because he talks about how the society went from just to unjust by these little compromises of deception. Slowly but surely, people unwilling to speak out about what was going on until finally they didn't even recognize the culture that they were living in anymore. It had become a bastion for wickedness and deception. There's a reason why on the pro-choice movement they refuse to call babies babies and they call them fetuses. Right? That little lie gives way for deception and self-justification. I wrote about this in my book on PTSD, where I talk about how different veterans tend to categorize the people that they fought with slurs. Right? So if you talk to veterans from different arenas of warfare, they tend to use a racial slur or something like that to describe the people that they fought, because it helps them in their consciences to justify what they did or what they saw. Right? These weren't really people, these were fill in the blank. Right? It helps them to deal with the emotional guilt that they experience after what they had done. Right? But the more you justify the corruption of your works, you're not being moved closer to Christ, you're being moved further away. Jesus in John 8 says, "If you know me, you will become my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." If you want to be set free from your guilt, stop justifying yourself. It's not helping you. And it's not helping the world that you're in either. If you want to be set free, you have to come face to face with the truth of what you've done and face to face with the gravity of what Christ has done for you. It's the only way to be set free. We'll talk more about that. Now, where does it exist today? Because like I said, it doesn't need a culture to do this. There are subcultures. So like, for instance, if you look at certain areas of the city that are run by elements of like gangs and things like that, you realize that these types of behaviors that we're talking about, violence and stealing and deception, they're more pronounced. Why? Because a subculture can be just as powerful as a big culture. This is how the church survived through so many centuries, being in a perverse culture. The subculture of the church was a bastion. It was a boundary that allowed Christians to practice our morality without being subsumed by the morality surrounding us. Subcultures are very, very powerful, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why church community is so important. As the values of our culture become increasingly subverted, you're going to need to be a part of a community that thinks differently. Otherwise, you will go along with the flood of this world. That's how our consciences work. It's how God has designed us. Now, where do subcultures of perversion exist in our world today? Where do they exist and how are they affecting people? Well, I don't have time to get into this. If you want to read more about it, you can read a very interesting book that I just finished called The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kengor, where he goes over some very radical evidence that Karl Marx may have actually been demon-possessed, which wasn't terribly shocking to me, but it was also kind of weird to hear the evidence laid out for me. But he also goes over just the communist movement and how it warped and how it mutated over time and how it infiltrated intentionally the institutions of our culture with the express intent of tearing down the institutions around us. Most of the travesties that we can think about in the last 100 years are because of this subversion. Even when you think about Nazism, as terrible as it was and as evil as it was itself a reaction to the communist propaganda of the day. Hitler would have never gained the type of following that he had if he wasn't fighting an evil as great as the communists in Germany. Where is this subversion happening that could turn a nation like ours into a nation like Sodom or a nation like, say, Russia? Well, they're not shy about this. If you read the communists, if you read the Marxists of our day, they've actually taken over already the main institutions of learning. That's where it's happening. So I interviewed my niece-in-law this week and was able to get from her a little part of her syllabus. So she's trying to become a teacher. Very noble, what she's trying to do. This is one of the classes that are mandatory for her. It's called The Foundations of Education for Social Justice. Okay? This is from the syllabus, and it's worded as a pledge. We recognize that those of us who enjoy a privileged status due to our racialized, gendered, or heteronormative, or otherwise privileged aspects of our identities may be unaware of the ways this privileged status marginalizes others. We pledge to listen to our colleagues, students, staff, and community members when any of us or others make efforts to remain diligent in maintaining awareness of macroaggressions and raise our awareness around issues of invisibility, marginalization, normativity, power, and privilege. The entrenched nature of oppression requires both institutional restructuring and new social discourses. Those of you guys who haven't read the Communist Manifesto, which, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, I don't know. But in the Communist Manifesto, that's straight out of Marx's language. That last sentence especially. What's it saying? It's saying the institutions, you are racist because you're in a racist society. You're not racist because of your decisions as an individual. You're racist because you're participating in a racist society. And the only way to undo that is to uproot the systems of power completely. It's a revolutionary language that they're using. I'll read it again just so you guys can see it. The entrenched nature of oppression requires both institutional restructuring and new social discourses. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx words it this way. He says, it is the fearless criticism of all that exists, which is exactly Satan's perspective. Everything that exists deserves to be torn down because I'm not at the top. Right? So, and again, if this seems a little like, those are just some crazy people in the universities. These are people who are being trained to teach your kids. That's what's happening. They're being trained on how to teach your children. They're being indoctrinated in how to train your children to think and to be prepared. These slow and subtle jabs prepare children to get to the top levels in which they can be absolutely subverted towards the purposes of people who don't have their best interests in mind. Vladimir Lenin once said this, "Give me 4 years with your children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted." We're not just giving them 4 years, are we? We're giving them a lot longer. So how do we approach this? Am I saying that we have to totally pull out of the system and get a field somewhere and build a commune? Maybe. No, I'm not. No, I'm not saying that. All right. So how do we remain good in a corrupting system? Because here's the deal. One of the ways that we could look at Lot, the most generous way that we could look at Lot, is that he was trying to change Sodom. That's the most generous way we could look at him. It says that he was sitting in the city gate, which is a byword for being in politics. He's protecting the messengers. He is giving aid to the stranger. But he had participated in the society so much that he himself had become corrupted, and he had lost his family. When he offers up his daughters to the mob, you have to realize in a very real sense he had already done it. He had already offered up his daughters to the mob because their moral compass had been so screwed up by the culture that they were living in that they didn't think twice about doing the evil and shameless acts that they did towards the end of their life. Right? That's what Lot had set them up to do. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, Paul says this, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. Awake to righteousness and do not sin. For some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." Many Christians will say, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. Yes. But at what point are you becoming of the world? Would you even know when that line is crossed? Would you even know when you are like Lot? And when it's finally time to speak up about something, the people in your life would think you're kidding. Do you know when you are actually making a difference in the system that you're in, as opposed to participating with its corrupting influence? There's a reason, by the way, there's a reason why God judges Sodom with fire. Fire in the Bible is a picture of spreading, right? And that makes sense, right? It spreads, it morphs, it metastasizes, and consumes. Proverbs 27, verse 20, it says this, "Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied." Right? The destruction, and by the way, Solzhenitsyn says this in his book. He says, every country believes that it could never happen here. And he says, and that belief is exactly what allows it to happen here. You have to believe it could happen here. And it happens through these little steps. Hell and destruction are never full. If you think, man, we've reached the peak, it can't get crazier than this, it could get crazier than this. It could get a lot crazier than this. Okay? There is no limit to how much Satan can bring about unbelievable destruction within our lives and the lives of those around us. And that's at a personal level as well as at a societal level. So how do we actually do this? Can we be in the world and not of the world? How do we even do that? The biggest thing, and this is hard to understand, is you must refuse to participate with lies. This is Matthew 5, verse 14. "You are the light of the world in a city that is set upon a hill that cannot be hidden." It's a weird juxtaposition, right? We're a light in the world, but yet we're set on a hill apart from the world. There's a sense in which we're a subculture as a church that keep each other correct when in the scriptures and the morality of God, but there's also a sense that we shine the light of God to the world around us. How do we do that? You're not going to do that by buying into the darkness of the world. That's not how these things work. Right? So let me give you an example. In Solzhenitsyn's time, he talks about how people would go to jail and they wouldn't say anything about it. They would just let it happen. It's like, oh, well, eventually people will notice. Eventually so many people will be arrested that people will notice. 20 million people died. Nobody noticed. These things don't happen by people being silent. These things happen by people speaking out and saying, no, this is not going to be allowed in my society. I'm going to say something about it. I'm not going to participate with something about it. My niece-in-law asked me, she said, would you be in this class? And I said, well, no. But that's because I'm a bit contrarian, to be honest. I used to just give my teachers grief for no reason whatsoever. So if I had an actual reason to give someone grief, I would definitely take advantage of that. But honestly, when you're looking at it, I said, I struggle with it because it's written in the form of a pledge. It's written in the form of a pledge. That means by signing this, you are agreeing to what they are saying. So I don't have a problem with you being in the class, but can you go to the teacher and say, I'm not signing this? I'll be in the class. Give me whatever grade you have to, but I am not signing this. That's how you refuse to be a vessel for lies. To sign it is to agree to what's being said. Right? It's to participate in lies. I was like, you're like, my niece-in-law is amazing, right? She's godly, she's wonderful, she has a good, solid foundation. I was like, most people are not like you. Most people are outside their family homes, they don't have support, they're listening to this stuff like a beating drum every single day, and they're being made to feel ashamed for their views and their values. How many of them are strong enough to hold up to that pressure for 4 years? By you signing this, you're giving endorsement to this being taught to your peers, to the people around you who mean well, who may even want to make a difference in the lives of kids. And the advice that Christians have been giving kids up until this point, honestly, I think it's been bad. Go along to get along. Get the A and then make a difference. It's like, do you really think that? Do you really think that we're going to build utopia on the back of lies? Do you really think that we're going to create order out of deception? Has it ever worked that way? Solzhenitsyn didn't believe so. That's why he wrote the book that he did. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, he got a Nobel Peace Prize for his work. And this is what he said at the end of it. He says, "One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world." Jesus represents the truth that cannot be silenced. In the Gospel of John, verse 1, it says this, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." A single word of truth can outweigh the whole world because lies and deception rely upon darkness. And no matter how overwhelming darkness might be, a single light pierces through it with absolute ease. All it takes for a society to tilt in the right direction is for a group of people to refuse to lie. For a group of people to stand up and say no. That's why, Tara's saying that 53% of evangelicals don't vote. That's interesting, right? Well, we're not going to participate with lies, so we're not going to do anything. Yeah, but you're not participating with the truth either, right? Darkness isn't overwhelmed by neutrality. Darkness is overwhelmed by light. You have to refuse to lie, and you have to tell the truth. You have to say what is real. So much of us are being pressured to go along with the deceptions around us, whether they're deceptions regarding sexuality or gender or DEI. I do have people talk to me about, wow, I'm going through this seminar in my work, and they're talking about this kind of crazy stuff, and I don't know what to do. And again, my only advice, my heart as a pastor is just, I feel for you. I don't have that. We don't have DEI seminars in our elder board, but I do feel for you. And all I can say is, again, my conscience is you just can't lie. If they ask you to sign a pledge, if they ask you to agree to something that you don't agree to, you have to stand up. And if you stand up to the world of lies, you're going to get what Jesus got. Jesus refused to lie, and he says, "This is the condemnation of the world, that light has shined in the darkness, and men have loved the darkness more than light." They had to kill Jesus because he was the light of the world. But this is the promise he gives us. John 16, verse 33. "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, for I have overcome the world." A church that decides to speak the truth and not compromise on deception is a church that will be targeted. Is a church that's not going to be liked. It's not going to be supported. We will have to suffer if things get worse. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you believe the contention of Christ, that all suffering in the hands of your Father can be formed into something beautiful. That you could be made new even in the midst of suffering. That you can go through something hard and be transformed into something right and good. Let's look at Lot for a second. Like I said, it seems like darkness from beginning to end, right? Not exactly. Lot's child, Moab, second child that he has, with his daughter, remind you. That child had a couple kids, and those kids had kids all the way down to a woman named Ruth. And Ruth fell in love with an Israelite named Boaz. And they had kids. And it goes down the line until you get King David. And then down the line, and you get Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a direct descendant of Lot. Is that radical? That's how powerful the light of the world is. That's how powerful the gospel is. That even something this dark, it takes a while, right? He didn't see it in his lifetime. But this event that is so evil and wicked, God actually used to redeem the whole world through his Son. Whatever evil has afflicted you, God can use in the same sense. And if we choose to participate with this power that can remake the world, that could save the world, redeem the world. We have participated with a power that cannot lose. The darkness cannot overcome it. You participate with lies, you may have temporary gain, but long term you are participating with a civilization and empire that will come crashing down. Let's pray. Father, we love you and we're thankful for you. We thank you that you have come into the world to shine the light of truth. Lord, and we pray that we would be people made strong and courageous to stand against the deception that's pervading our culture right now. I think it's so easy to look at the things being said and see it as silly or goofy or foolish, but it's also evil. And it also has an intent to subvert your good purposes. So Lord, I pray that we would learn the lesson from Sodom. We would learn how cultures become perverse. We would learn how our own hearts become perverse over time. And we would learn to walk in truth, no matter what the cost might be, because we know that any cost we pay, no matter how high, in your hands, Lord, can be turned into eternal glory. We're thankful and we love you, and in your name, amen. And so now we're going to join in a time of communion. And it is a time to actively share in the sufferings of our Lord. That's literally what it is. By taking his body and taking his blood, we're commemorating the fact that Jesus' gift to us was not given without suffering. It was given through great sacrifice. And by taking it into ourselves, we're participating with that mentality. The mentality not of the men of Sodom that would take from someone else against their will, but a mentality that would give of ourselves for the benefit of all. So if you are a believer and you have given your life to Christ, I ask that you take this communion. You celebrate this time with your Lord, and you remember what he has done for you. If you haven't yet done that, I ask that you let the elements pass you by. If you want to know more about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to give your life to the Lord, please talk to myself or one of the other elders after the service is over. But let's meditate on this passage. Romans 8, verse 16. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us.